Rochester Castle rises on the east bank of the River Medway in the historic town of Rochester in Kent, southeast England. From the very beginning, its position shaped its destiny, overlooking both the river and Watling Street, an ancient Roman road that remained one of England's main routes for centuries. The castle stood at a crossroads of trade, movement, and military power. Anyone who wished to control access to London from the southeast or defend the coastline from invasion had to reckon with Rochester. The most striking feature of the castle is its immense stone keep, built in the 12th century. Towering above the surrounding landscape, this structure was not only a last refuge in times of siege, but also a powerful symbol of authority. Remarkably well preserved for its age, the keep is considered one of the finest surviving examples of Norman military architecture in either England or France. Its thick walls, vast internal spaces, and commanding height reflect a world in which castles were instruments of domination as much as defence. The story of Rochester Castle begins in the turbulent years following the Norman Conquest of 1066. In the aftermath of William the Conqueror's victory, a first castle was established at Rochester and granted to Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother and one of the most powerful men in England. This early fortress was likely made of earth and timber, typical of the immediate post-conquest period, and served as both a military stronghold and a symbol of Norman control over a newly conquered land. The castle soon found itself drawn into political conflict. In 1088, following William the Conqueror's death, England was shaken by rebellion over who should succeed him. Bishop Odo supported Robert Curthose, William's eldest son, against the reigning king, William Rufus. Rochester became a headquarters for the rebellion, turning the castle into a focal point of resistance. Royal forces responded decisively, besieging both the city and the castle. After the garrison surrendered, the rebellion collapsed, and the first castle was abandoned, its brief life ending in defeat. Determined to secure this vital location, William Rufus ordered the construction of a new and far stronger fortress between 1087 and 1089. The task was given to Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, a skilled administrator and experienced castle builder. Gundulf laid out the foundations of the castle as we know it today, defining its overall size and form. Although much of his work was later altered or replaced, parts of this early stone castle still survive, embedded within the fabric of the later structure. In 1127, King Henry I granted Rochester Castle to the Archbishop of Canterbury in perpetuity, ensuring that it remained under ecclesiastical control while still serving royal interests. It was during this period that the castle gained its most iconic feature. Archbishop William de Corbet commissioned the construction of the massive stone keep that still dominates the site. Built with enormous blocks of stone and designed to withstand prolonged siege, the keep embodied the military sophistication of the Norman elite and the close relationship between church and crown in medieval England. Throughout the 12th century, Rochester Castle remained in the hands of the archbishops, but its importance made it a recurring target during periods of unrest. Its most famous and dramatic moment came during the First Barons' War between 1215 and 1217, a conflict sparked by King John's refusal to honour the Magna Carta. Rebel barons seized the castle from Archbishop Stephen Langton and prepared to hold it against the king himself. King John responded with overwhelming force, laying siege to Rochester in one of the most intense military confrontations of the medieval period. Chroniclers of the time described the siege in vivid terms, noting that few in living memory had witnessed resistance so determined or pressure so relentless. The king's forces battered the outer defences and even undermined the keep, causing one corner of the great tower to collapse. After more than 7 weeks of fighting, starvation finally broke the defenders' resolve, and the garrison surrendered. The castle lay badly damaged, its walls breached, and its once proud keep partially ruined. Yet even this victory proved fleeting. In 1216, French forces led by Prince Louis, invited by the rebel barons, captured Rochester Castle from King John. John died later that year, and his young son Henry III ascended the throne. With the war's end in 1217, the castle returned to royal control, marking a new chapter in its long and troubled history. Rochester Castle faced siege once again in 1264 during the Second Barons' War. A conflict between Henry III and rebellious nobles led by Simon de Montfort. This time, the castle's constable, Roger de Leybourne, held it firmly for the king. Rebel forces entered Rochester and attempted to storm the fortress, but the defenders held out. After a week of failed assaults and with royal relief forces approaching, the rebels abandoned the siege. Though the castle remained unconquered, it suffered serious damage that would not be fully repaired for generations. The castle's final episode of military violence came much later, in 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt. Swept up in the chaos of popular uprising, Rochester Castle was captured and ransacked. By this point, however, its military value was already declining. Advances in warfare and changes in political structure gradually rendered great stone fortresses like Rochester obsolete. Over the following centuries, the castle fell into disuse. Stone from its walls was reused in other buildings, and its maintenance became sporadic. Eventually, the Crown relinquished active custodianship. In the 19th century, however, attitudes toward the medieval past began to change. Rochester Castle and its grounds were open to the public in the 1870s, transformed into a historic park and symbol of national heritage. Restoration and stabilization work continued through the 19th and 20th centuries, preserving the ruins for future generations. Today, Rochester Castle stands as a powerful reminder of England's medieval past. Protected as a Grade 1 listed building and a scheduled monument, it is now cared for by English Heritage and open to the public. Its towering keep, scarred walls, and commanding views over the Medway tell a story of conquest, rebellion, endurance, and decline. A stone chronicle of nearly 1,000 years of English history. Castles were brought to England by the Normans in the 11th century, and their rapid construction after the conquest of 1066 was one of the key tools by which the new rulers secured their authority over a hostile and unfamiliar land. These early castles were not simply defensive structures. They were visible statements of power, domination, and control. Rochester, already an ancient and important settlement, naturally became one of the focal points of this strategy. Built on the site of a former Roman town, it stood where the River Medway met Watling Street, a Roman road that remained one of the most vital routes in England. Whoever held Rochester controlled movement between London, the southeast coast, and the interior of the kingdom. For many years, historians assumed that Rochester's first Norman castle stood beside the river, just outside the southwest corner of the Roman town walls. This area later became known as Bowley Hill, a name that preserved the memory of an early fortification long after it had vanished from the landscape. Archaeologist Tom McNeill has suggested that the earliest Norman castles in England, including Rochester's first fortress, may have been almost purely military installations. Rather than refined residences, they were designed to house large garrisons of troops in newly conquered and potentially hostile territory, allowing the Normans to respond quickly to rebellion or invasion. The Domesday Book of 1086 offers a rare glimpse into the social and economic consequences of castle building at Rochester. It records that the Bishop of Rochester was compensated with land in Aylesford, valued at 17 shillings and 4 pence, in exchange for land taken to build the castle. Of the 48 castles mentioned in the survey, Rochester is unique in this respect. It is the only castle for which displaced landowners were formally reimbursed. This detail alone highlights the importance attached to the site and the sensitivity surrounding its construction. From the late 11th century onward, Rochester Castle was supported through the feudal obligation known as castle guard. Under this system, knights were required to serve a fixed period, guarding a castle on behalf of their lord. While no complete list of castles owed this service survives, military historian Cathcart King observed that castle guard was generally reserved for the most prestigious and strategically significant fortresses. Rochester's obligation amounted to 60 knights' fees, a remarkably high number that clearly marked it as one of the most important strongholds in England. The castle's first true test came almost immediately. It was probably William the Conqueror himself who granted Rochester and its castle to Bishop Odo of Bayeux, his half-brother and one of the most powerful men in Norman England. When William died in 1087, his lands were divided between his sons. Robert Curthose became Duke of Normandy, while William Rufus inherited the English crown. This division angered many Norman nobles, who preferred a single ruler over both territories. Bishop Odo became one of the leading supporters of Robert's claim to the English throne. In 1088, Rochester Castle was drawn into open rebellion. Odo transformed it into one of the main headquarters of the revolt. Its position in Kent made it an ideal base for launching raids toward London while harassing royal forces across the surrounding countryside. William Rufus marched out from London to crush the rebellion, initially heading toward Rochester. However, news reached him that Odo had moved to Pevensey Castle, another rebel stronghold. The king changed course, captured Pevensey, and took Odo prisoner. Under duress, Odo swore an oath to surrender Rochester to the king's men. William sent a force to the city, escorting Odo as proof of his authority. Instead of yielding, the garrison launched a surprise attack, capturing the entire royal delegation. Enraged, William Rufus laid siege to both the city and the castle. According to the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, the siege began in May 1088. 2 temporary siege castles were constructed to cut off Rochester's supply lines and protect the besieging army from sudden attacks. Conditions inside the city rapidly deteriorated. Disease spread through the crowded streets, worsened by summer heat and swarms of flies. After prolonged suffering, the garrison finally surrendered. The terms were harsh but controlled. Odo, Eustace of Boulogne, and Robert of Belem were allowed to leave with their weapons and horses, but their English lands were confiscated. With the rebellion crushed, Rochester's first castle lost its purpose and was likely abandoned soon afterward. The siege castles were dismantled and disappeared entirely from the landscape. The abandonment of the first castle did not mean the end of Rochester as a military centre. Instead, it was replaced by a far more ambitious stone fortress on the site of the present castle, within the southwest corner of the town walls. This second castle was founded between 1087 and 1089 under the direction of Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester. Its construction arose from a complex negotiation between church and crown. William the Conqueror had granted the manor of Haddenham to Archbishop Lanfranc for life, and Lanfranc had passed its income to the monks of Rochester. After the Conqueror's death, both Lanfranc and Gundulf sought confirmation of this grant from William Rufus. The king demanded £100, a sum the bishops could not afford. A compromise was reached. Instead of cash, Gundulf would build a new stone castle at Rochester for the king. Although the bishops feared spiralling costs and long-term responsibility, they were persuaded that the castle could be built for £40 and then transferred to royal control. In reality, the final cost was closer to £60. Gundulf, however, was no ordinary bishop. He was an accomplished architect who had overseen the construction of the White Tower at the Tower of London, and his expertise is evident in Rochester's early stone defences. Gundulf's castle stood beside Rochester Cathedral, creating a powerful visual and symbolic connection between military and religious authority. Archaeologist Oliver Crichton has noted that when castles were built close to major churches or cathedrals, it often reflected shared ownership and shared labour. The same craftsmen likely worked on both buildings, resulting in architectural similarities. Rochester, alongside Durham and Old Sarum, stands as one of the finest examples of a tightly linked castle-cathedral complex in medieval England. In 1127, King Henry I granted Rochester Castle to the Archbishop of Canterbury, William de Corbet, and his successors forever. Corbet received explicit permission to construct a great tower within the castle and hold it in perpetuity. The result was the immense stone keep that still dominates Rochester today. Rising high above the curtain walls, it was both a fortress and a residence, containing the castle's finest accommodation, while also serving as a last line of defence in times of siege. Construction progressed steadily, at roughly 10 feet per year. The keep was completed before Corbet's death in 1138 and certainly before 1141, when Robert, Earl of Gloucester, was imprisoned there during the civil war known as the Anarchy. After the keep's completion, little new building took place in the 12th century, though maintenance continued. Royal financial records known as pipe rolls show that Rochester Castle regularly received funds for upkeep, with major spending spikes during periods of unrest. More than £100 was spent in 1172 to 1173 during the rebellion of Henry II's sons, and further investment followed the loss of Normandy in 1204, when King John strengthened southeastern castles in anticipation of French invasion. By the early 13th century, Rochester Castle had become one of the most heavily fortified and strategically vital strongholds in England. Its massive keep, stone walls, and commanding position embodied the evolution of Norman power from conquest to consolidation. More than a military installation, it stood as a lasting monument to the uneasy alliance between kings, bishops, and barons in medieval England, a place where political ambition, rebellion, and royal authority repeatedly collided in stone and blood. Rochester Castle's story takes a darker, more dramatic turn at the end of the 12th century, when the old assumption, this castle belongs to the Archbishops of Canterbury, begins to crack under the pressure of royal suspicion, baronial rebellion, and the sheer strategic value of the fortress itself. Because Rochester sat on the Medway and the road to London, it was never just a local stronghold. It was a lever. Whoever controlled it could block armies, threaten the capital, and dominate the entire southeast. Even before open war erupted, there were warning signs that King John was not comfortable leaving Rochester in anyone else's hands. John became king in 1199, but he did not confirm Hubert Walter as custodian until July 1202, an unusual hesitation that hints at a larger aim, pulling this key castle back under direct royal control. And John's reign, already fragile, soon tilted into crisis. In 1212, a plot to overthrow him was uncovered, one more proof that the political ground beneath the king was unstable. Then came the disaster of July 12, 14 at the Battle of Bouvines, which smashed John's hopes of restoring Norman lands and amplified the anger of English magnates. He returned to England in October 1214, not as a triumphant ruler, but as a king whose failures invited challenge. By early 1215, the realm was sliding toward civil war. Northern barons rose against John. In May, a group of magnates took the extraordinary step of renouncing their feudal loyalty and seized major centres, London, Lincoln, Exeter, closing the ring around royal authority. John tried to manage this with political manoeuvre rather than immediate force, and Rochester Castle became part of that chess game. He persuaded Stephen Langton, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, to allow a royal constable, Reginald de Cornhill, to take control of the castle, at least temporarily. The arrangement was carefully worded. The castle would revert to the Archbishop at Easter, 1215, later extended to Easter, 1216, unless peace returned sooner. On paper, it looked like a compromise. In reality, it exposed how badly John wanted Rochester. Even more revealing is the language John used when he returned control to Langton at one point, insisting the Archbishop hold it, so that by it no ill or harm shall come to us or our kingdom. It was a sentence packed with fear that the castle might become a knife at the throat of the crown. For a brief moment, peace seemed possible. John met the rebel barons at Runnymede, and on June 19, 1215 they renewed oaths of fealty and sealed the settlement that later generations would call Magna Carta. But peace in 1215 was thin ice over deep water. Almost immediately, that political settlement began to splinter. The deal that had installed a royal constable at Rochester dissolved, and control returned to Langton. Yet, the trust between king and barons was already gone. Soon, a rebel group moved toward Rochester with a clear goal: hold the city and the castle against the king and block his path to London. Exactly how the rebels took the castle is messy, and that uncertainty itself is revealing. Contemporary chroniclers describe a sequence of pressure, fear, and shifting loyalties. Ralph of Coggeshall says John demanded that Langton surrender the castle to royal control, and Langton refused. The rebels, however, feared that Langton might eventually be forced into compliance, so they seized the castle first. And it appears they did so with the consent, or at least the cooperation, of Reginald de Cornhill, the very royal constable John had earlier installed. In other words, Rochester didn't simply fall. It slid into rebel hands through a chain reaction of mistrust. Langton soon left the country, and John's anger boiled over. In a letter to his justiciar, Hubert de Burgh, John denounced Langton as a traitor for not delivering Rochester in our so great need. From this point on, Rochester Castle was no longer treated as a permanent archiepiscopal possession. In the logic of a paranoid king, it had become a dangerously independent weapon. Now the military stage was set. John was in southeast England hiring mercenaries, professional soldiers who could be paid and trusted more than wavering nobles. Rochester blocked the direct route to London, and London was in rebel hands. As far as John was concerned, Rochester was not a side problem. It was the gate on the road to the capital. The rebel garrison was formidable. Chroniclers speak of roughly 95 to 140 knights, backed by crossbowmen, sergeants, and other soldiers. The leadership at Rochester is often associated with William d'Aubigny of Belvoir. These were not desperate peasants behind walls. They were hardened aristocratic fighters with equipment, experience, and the kind of pride that made surrender humiliating. They meant to hold. John moved fast. He arrived at Rochester on the 13th of October, 1215, but royal forces were already in motion. They had taken the city by surprise on the 11th of October and begun the siege of the castle itself. To prevent a relief army from London crossing into the fight, Rochester Bridge was pulled down. The message was clear. The castle would be isolated and crushed, no matter the cost. What followed was the largest siege in England up to that point, lasting nearly 2 months, an ordeal of stone, fire, and starvation. You can picture the scene. Engines of war crouched around the walls, the crash of projectiles, the constant shouting, the smoke of burning timber and smashed masonry. The Barnwell chronicler describes 5 great siege engines pounding the walls day and night, while smaller bows and crossbows filled the air with arrows and bolts. Some sources say the engines tore open the outer defences. Others argue they were not enough, and the king turned to more direct, brutal methods. Because when stone walls refuse to break, medieval warfare goes underground. John ordered mining, digging beneath the walls so they could be collapsed from below. A letter from 14th October shows the king urgently demanding vast numbers of picks be produced by day and night and shipped to Rochester. This is one of the clearest windows into siege logistics. The king is not merely commanding, he's micromanaging supply. Tools are as important as soldiers. A relief force of 700 horse set out from London on October 26th, but turned back before reaching Rochester. Perhaps because they learned John was advancing to intercept them. The rebels were alone. Once the outer walls were breached, the defenders fell back into the ultimate refuge, the keep. If the outer ward is a shield, the keep is the fist behind it. Rochester's great tower was built to endure exactly this moment, and it proved terrifyingly resilient. Siege engines could batter it, missiles could scar it, but the keep still stood. So John returned to mining, targeting the southeast corner of the tower itself. This was siegecraft at its most ruthless. Tunnels were dug beneath the keep, and wooden props held the earth up like ribs beneath a beast. Then came one of the most famous orders of John's reign, an instruction that sounds almost like a grim joke if you forget what it meant in practice. On November 25th, from Rochester, John demanded 40 of the fattest pigs, least good for eating, to be sent at once, so their fat could be used to fuel the fire that would burn the support timbers of the mine. When the props burned through, the tunnel collapsed, and with it, the corner of the keep came down in thunder and dust. Yet even then, Rochester did not simply fall. The keep had a critical internal feature, a massive cross wall dividing it into 2 halves. When one corner collapsed, the garrison retreated behind this stone partition and continued resisting, effectively sacrificing half the building to save the other half. The Barnwell chronicler noted the grim genius of the design, a wall so strong it separated ruin from refuge. The castle was broken, but not conquered. Inside, conditions turned from harsh to desperate. Food dwindled, men ate horse flesh. The defenders tried to reduce mouths to feed by sending out those least able to fight. Some accounts say the besiegers mutilated these people, cutting off hands and feet. Though sources differ, and medieval chroniclers sometimes amplified horror to express moral judgment. But the core truth is unmistakable. The garrison was being crushed by hunger as much as by stone and fire. On 30 November 1215, after weeks of resistance, the garrison surrendered. John, furious and vengeful, initially wanted to execute them all, an act that would have followed a harsh medieval logic. If you force a long, bloody siege, you pay with blood. But Savaric de Morleans, one of John's captains, warned him against it. If the king slaughtered surrendering defenders, rebels would do the same to royal garrisons elsewhere. In the end, only one man was executed, a crossbowman who had once served the king since childhood, hanged as a symbol that betrayal, especially from a former servant, was unforgivable. Many rebels were imprisoned in royal castles like Corfe. The Barnwell chronicler concluded with a line, that captures the psychological shock of the siege. People, he said, trusted castles less afterward. If a fortress as mighty as Rochester could be cracked, what was truly safe? But the war was not over, because the baronial rebellion soon gained a foreign champion. The rebels invited Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II, to become their leader and, if victorious, their king. In 1216, Louis arrived in England and captured Rochester Castle. Strikingly, we do not know exactly how. No surviving document records the details. That silence itself is intriguing. Perhaps the castle fell quickly due to depleted defences. Perhaps there was negotiation. Perhaps the garrison, exhausted and repair work unfinished, could not resist. Whatever happened, Rochester again changed hands as the kingdom's crisis deepened. Then, in 1216, King John died. His heir, Henry III, was only 9 years old. Many barons who had opposed John could accept a child king more readily than a hated adult ruler, and as the political tide shifted, Louis's prospects collapsed. With no realistic path to the throne, he eventually withdrew to France. By 1217, Rochester Castle returned to royal control, but it was battered, broken, and urgently in need of rebuilding. Henry III's government poured money into repairs. Between 1217 and 1237, roughly £680 was spent, an enormous sum, with about £530 devoted to restoring the keep. The priority was clear: the tower had to be made whole, strong, and usable again. Work began with the curtain walls, restoring the outer shell that made the castle a functioning fortress. A chapel was built within the castle, reinforcing that this was not just a military site, but a lived-in, administered space. In 1226, the hall, buttery, and dispensary were repaired. Practical buildings for daily life and supply, crucial for any fortress expected to hold out in siege. The keep repairs likely began around 1226, were mostly complete by 1227, and continued until 1232. One particularly visible result of this period is the replacement and reinforcement of damaged structures, most famously expressed later in features like the round tower, built to address vulnerabilities revealed by John's mining. And Henry did more than patch the castle. He invested in making it workable and prestigious. In 1244, he funded a second chapel near the royal apartments, suggesting the presence of a more developed residential zone. Stables and an almonry followed. The main gatehouse was rebuilt around 1249 to 1250, strengthening the castle's front door, the place where authority is both symbolised and defended. Further repairs continued into the 1250s, and as Henry's own relationship with his barons deteriorated later in his reign, attention again turned to defence. Rochester remained a political weather vane. When the realm grew tense, the castle was reinforced. And then, as if history were repeating itself, Rochester faced another great storm. By 1258, Henry III's reign was in crisis. Failure in Wales, agricultural hardship and famine, and growing discontent among the magnates. Reform was demanded, then imposed. A council of 15 magnates took control, and royal authority cracked. When Henry regained power in 1261 with foreign help, the deeper conflict remained unresolved. Simon de Montfort rose as the leader of rebellion, and by 1264 England had again fallen into civil war. In that year, Rochester's Constable Roger de Leybourne held the castle for the king, with John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, as co-commander of the garrison. The rebels arrived under Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Hertford, and laid siege on the 17th of April. The attack came from the Rochester side of the Medway, likely from the south or west. As the rebels advanced, the Royalist defenders burned the suburbs. Harsh, tactical destruction meant to deny cover and resources to the enemy. Even the King's Hall inside the castle was burned, a sacrificial act to prevent it being used against them. Simon de Montfort moved from London to coordinate a two-pronged assault. The rebels struggled to cross the Medway at first, driven back twice, but on April 18th, Good Friday, they succeeded, possibly using a fireship. The smoke may have provided cover, or the ship may have helped damage the bridge while troops moved by water. In the evening they entered Rochester, and that night the cathedral was raided, a reminder that civil war erodes sacred boundaries as quickly as political ones. The next day, the rebels seized the castle's outer enclosure. Once again, the royal garrison retreated to the keep. Once again, the keep did what it was built to do. It refused to break. Because it was Easter Sunday, fighting paused, an eerie moment of religious calendar interrupting violence, but on Monday, siege engines were raised and aimed at the tower. The defenders endured, and after a week the keep still stood. A source claims the besiegers were about to begin mining, echoing the methods of 1215, when news arrived. Henry III and his son, Prince Edward, were approaching with a relief force. The rebels abandoned the siege on 26th April. Rochester had survived again, not because the walls were untouched, but because the keep was a nightmare to crack, and because relief arrived before the rebels committed to the slow, ugly work of digging the ground out from beneath it. After the smoke of the Second Baron's War drifted away in 1264, Rochester Castle had technically survived. But survival and health are two very different things. The garrison had held out inside the keep, yet the rest of the fortress was left battered, burned, and broken. What followed was not an immediate revival, but something far more common in the long lives of medieval castles: neglect, opportunism, and slow decay. And in Rochester's case, that decline was so prolonged that it became part of the castle's identity, turning a once critical royal stronghold into a quarry, then a curiosity, and finally a protected monument. For decades after 1264, there was no serious attempt to restore the damage. Even as the castle remained in use, its fabric was treated with a kind of careless familiarity. By 1275, observers were already recording a scandal. The constables responsible for the site were not merely failing to repair it, they were actively making it worse. Stone was being stolen from the castle and reused elsewhere, as if the fortress were a convenient storehouse of ready-cut building material. In 1281, the decline was made official. John of Cobham, the constable, was granted permission to pull down the hall and chambers that had been left as burned-out shells since the siege. It wasn't an act of restoration, it was a controlled demolition, the formal acknowledgement that large parts of the castle had become unusable ruins. As the 14th century advanced, survey after survey painted a bleak picture. In 1340, officials estimated that repairs would cost around £600, an enormous sum, but still within the realm of possibility for a crown that truly cared. 23 years later, a new survey gave a far more alarming figure: 3,333 6 shillings 8 pence. Whether this reflected inflation, a more thorough assessment, or simply the accelerating collapse of the structure, the message was unmistakable. Each year of neglect multiplied the bill. Nature helped. Wind, rain, frost, and time worked on cracks and weakened joints. In 1362, a great wind struck, damaging the castle further. By 1369, the place had become almost a skeleton of its former self. Only a handful of structures still stood: the keep, the gatehouses, a hall, a kitchen, and a stable. And even these were described as ruined. Yet the keep, though desperate for repair, remained the heart of life inside the castle. Even in decay, it was still shelter, storage, and the centre of the castle's domestic world. The castle also continued to serve as a place of confinement, a role that medieval fortresses often retained even when their military value declined. In 1314, Elizabeth de Burgh, sometimes linked in later retellings to the Scottish Wars, was held there for several months. This reminds us that castles were not only instruments of war, they were instruments of state control used to hold people whose capture carried political weight. Serious repair finally arrived under Edward III, 1327 to 1377, and not by coincidence. Edward's reign was defined by renewed military conflict with France, the 100 Years' War, and with French raids striking England's southern coast, even half-ruined fortresses became valuable again. Between May 1367 and September 1370, a major repair campaign costing £2,262 was undertaken, focusing on the curtain wall and strengthening the outer defences. 2 new mural towers were built, one replacing an older tower on the same site, positioned to the northeast of the keep. They still stand today, like hard punctuation marks in the story of the castle's later medieval life. Further work continued until Edward's death in 1377. Yet something important changed in this era. The royal apartments built in Henry III's time were never repaired. That absence is telling. It suggests Rochester had fallen out of favour as a royal residence. The castle was no longer primarily a place where kings and their court came to stay in comfort. Its role shifted instead toward the practical. A barracks, an administrative base, a strategic post guarding a route, useful but no longer glamorous. In other words, Rochester stopped being a palace fortress and became a working fortress. That defensive emphasis continued under Richard II, 1377 to 1400, who invested about £500 in repairs. Again likely driven by the threat of French attacks as England's fortunes in the war worsened. The most significant project was a new tower at the north end of the castle, overlooking the bridge over the Medway. A clear statement of priority. Control the bridge, control the road. Control the road, control the region. Records mention £350, spent between 1378 and 1383 on a new tower. Very likely the one designed to guard that vital crossing. Then came the castle's last taste of real violence. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, Rochester Castle was besieged and captured by rebels who plundered it and released a prisoner. This moment is easy to overlook beside the Great Baronial Wars, but it matters because it shows the castle's symbolic power. Even as a declining fortress, it remained a target, an emblem of authority worth striking. Later sums spent in the 1380s and 1390s may, at least in part, reflect repairs after that upheaval. In the 15th century, Rochester slid into a quieter kind of existence. Under Henry IV and Henry V, it passed into the guardianship of the Earl of Arundel and his brother, and in 1423 it was granted to Henry V's widow, Catherine of Valois, as part of her dower, essentially a financial support package, tied to property rights. When she died in 1437, responsibility passed to the clerk of the king's works. Yet despite these administrative shifts, the records show no major building work in the 1400s. The castle was still there, still owned, still counted, but not truly renewed. The next vivid episode comes not from war, but from royal theatre. On New Year's Day, 1540, Henry VIII visited Rochester Castle, in disguise to surprise his new betrothed, Anne of Cleves, who was resting there on her way to Greenwich. Anne did not recognise him and rejected his advances. An incident that embarrassed Henry deeply and fed into the rapid collapse of their marriage. Only months later. It's one of those almost cinematic moments where a crumbling medieval fortress becomes the backdrop for personal humiliation at the heart of Tudor politics. By the later 16th century, the castle's military relevance was clearly fading. The surrounding ditch began to be leased out, evidence that the defences were no longer treated as a critical protective system, but as usable land. And then came the most brutal measure of all. Between 1599 and 1601, stone from Rochester Castle was reused to build nearby Upnor Castle, an artillery fort designed for a new age of gunpowder warfare. This is the turning point where the medieval castle becomes literal, raw material for modern defence. Stone by stone, the old world is cannibalised to build the new. In 1610, James I granted control of the castle to Sir Anthony Weldon. Rochester continued to appear in the lives of the elite. Anne of Denmark and her daughter Princess Elizabeth visited and dined there in April 1613, before Elizabeth sailed for Heidelberg. Travel, ceremony, and status still clung to the place. And by the 17th century, the castle was already slipping into another role. An early tourist attraction. Samuel Pepys commented on its condition, and the fact that people were visiting, observing, and writing about it suggests that Rochester's ruin value had begun, its appeal as a historic relic, rather than a working fortress. During the English Civil War, Anthony Weldon supported Parliament. Interestingly, the castle saw no fighting, even when Rochester itself was captured by Royalists in 1648. That silence speaks loudly. The castle was probably no longer a reliable fortification worth contesting. Weldon's allegiance may also have spared the site from slighting. The deliberate destruction of castles after the war, a fate that hit many other strongholds. Rochester survived, perhaps, because it was already too far gone to be strategically dangerous. But survival did not guarantee safety. In the 18th century, Walker Weldon damaged part of the outer wall to sell building material and even considered dismantling more, only abandoning the plan later. Drawings from this period suggest a significant internal change. The great cross wall inside the keep, so crucial during the siege of 1215, may have been removed by then. Yet not everything was abandoned. The two towers in the southeast wall were still used as accommodation, and in 1743 prisoners were held at the site, likely in huts. Even in ruin, the place kept being repurposed. Ownership passed through families, from the Weldons to Thomas Bleshenden, and by 1774 to Robert Child, whose family held it until 1884. There were even plans in 1780 to reuse Rochester as an army barracks, an attempt to drag the medieval shell back into military service, though it did not succeed. And then something else happened. Rochester became beautiful, in a new way. In the late 18th century, the ruins inspired the artist J.M.W. Turner in one of his early oil paintings. This was the era of the picturesque, when crumbling castles, ivy-covered walls, and broken arches became fashionable symbols of romantic history and nature's triumph over stone. The castle, once feared as a weapon of power, became admired as a poetic fragment of the past. By the 19th century, gardens were created inside the enclosure. Rochester, now a town shaped by memory as much as by commerce, embraced its ruin. Charles Dickens lived nearby and wove the castle into the atmosphere of his work, describing it through a character as a glorious pile, full of frowning walls, tottering arches, dark nooks, and crumbling stones. Like many historic ruins, Rochester accumulated stories, some whispered, some written, about hauntings, a white lady said to wander the grounds, and even Dickens himself rumoured to haunt the moat on Christmas Eve. Whether believed or not, these legends show how thoroughly the castle had moved from military reality into cultural imagination. Preservation efforts began slowly. In 1826, repairs were made to the well in the keep. Around the same time, A.W.N. Pugin surveyed the site and excavated around the keep to understand its construction. In a moment that feels half scholarly and half folkloric, he even descended into the well in a bucket searching for treasure, unsuccessfully, but leaving behind a vivid image of early antiquarian curiosity. A major turning point arrived in 1870 when Victor Child Villiers, 7th Earl of Jersey, leased the castle to the Corporation of Rochester to be opened as a public park. When it opened in 1872, Rochester Castle was presented deliberately as a picturesque ruin, trees planted in the enclosure, ivy allowed to cloak the walls, and the whole place framed as heritage scenery. In 1884, the corporation bought the castle outright for £6,572, a significant investment that signalled a new era. The castle was no longer a private asset or a convenient quarry, but a civic treasure. Repairs followed. Between 1896 and 1904, George Payne carried out restoration work. In the early 20th century, the grounds even hosted symbols of modern warfare. A German field gun, a First World War tank, a bandstand, objects later removed by 1961 as tastes and priorities changed. Ivy was stripped from the keep between 1919 and 1931, and the planting was reduced, shifting the presentation away from romantic overgrowth toward clearer conservation. In 1960, archaeologists investigated Bowley Hill, the supposed site of the earliest castle, but excavation did not yield firm dating evidence. The question remains open, a reminder that even famous sites keep some secrets buried. By 1961, the castle's condition demanded urgent attention again. Repairs were estimated at £30,000. In 1965, the Ministry of Public Building and Works took over care from the local corporation. Though frustratingly, detailed records of exactly what was done have since gone missing. Between 1962 and 1965, buildings were removed from the ditch, clearing the defensive landscape that had been cluttered by later use. In 1984, guardianship passed to English Heritage, and since 1995 the City of Rochester has handled day-to-day management. Yet conservation is never finished. At the start of the 21st century, descaling work, removing surface deposits, ironically contributed to further decay in parts of the keep, and one mural tower needed maintenance. Because the keep remains structurally fragile, public access is restricted and protective netting has been installed to safeguard visitors from falling stone. At different times in the 1970s and 1990s, people even debated whether the keep should be given new floors and a roof. But conservation experts worried that adding a roof would change the internal climate, potentially accelerating decay in other ways. With historic buildings, every fix can create a new problem. When you stand before Rochester Castle today, it is easy to imagine that its walls have always been there, solid, inevitable, permanent. But the truth is far more elusive. Rochester's earliest castle has vanished so completely that even its exact location is still debated. The first fortress left behind, shadows, not blueprints, scattered hints in documents, suggestive earthworks, and a landscape that has been reshaped again and again by later building, demolition, and modern town life. What we do know is this: the Normans did not conquer England with battles alone. They conquered it with castles, fast-built, intimidating strongholds planted like iron nails into the conquered land. And Rochester, sitting at the junction of the River Medway and Watling Street, was exactly the kind of place they could not afford to leave unsecured. Because Rochester was not just a town, it was a gateway. It stood on the footprint of a Roman settlement, guarded by old walls and positioned on a route that had carried armies and commerce since antiquity. Watling Street, the Roman road, still functioned as a strategic artery running toward London and beyond. The Medway, meanwhile, was both a defensive barrier and a transport highway. Whoever held Rochester could block movement, control crossings, monitor trade, and, most crucially, threaten or defend the route to the capital. That is why a Norman castle appeared here so early, and why its story would become intertwined with rebellion, siege, and royal power for centuries. Almost nothing certain survives about the design of the first castle. It likely followed the standard Norman template used across England in the late 11th century. A motte and bailey. Imagine a steep mound, the motte, topped with a timber tower surrounded by an outer courtyard. The bailey, defended by palisades, earthen banks and ditches. These were castles designed for speed. Timber and earth could be raised quickly by large labour forces, allowing the Normans to create instant strongpoints in potentially hostile territory. But where exactly did Rochester's first castle stand? For a long time, historians placed it near the river, just outside the southwest corner of the old town walls, on a site later called Bowley Hill. The name itself sounds like an echo, an old local memory of fortifications that had once stood there. Yet Bowley Hill is not simply a convenient open space. It is a natural outcrop of rock, exactly the kind of ground that could have served as a motte-like platform, needing less earth to be piled up to achieve defensive height. That geological detail matters because it fits Norman logic. Build quickly, use the terrain, establish dominance. Still, Bowley Hill is controversial. Some have argued it was the site of the first castle. Others suggest it might have been an outwork, an extra defensive position reinforcing later fortifications. And there is an even more intriguing possibility. It could have been an abandoned siege castle like the temporary siege castles documented during the 1088 siege, hastily built by besiegers to blockade and pressure the town. If that is true, then Bowley Hill would not be the original Norman fortress at all, but a wartime scar, an earth and timber structure left behind when the crisis ended. Archaeology has not yet delivered a final answer, so the question remains part of Rochester's atmosphere. A castle whose earliest beginning is still half buried in speculation. While the first fortress fades into mystery, the next phase is much clearer. In the late 11th century, Bishop Gundulf of Rochester built the castle that set the foundations for everything that followed. This was no longer a quick timber stronghold. Gundulf's castle was enclosed by a stone wall, a far more permanent and expensive statement of power. Crucially, it was positioned inside the town defences in the southwest corner of the walled city. And it didn't start from nothing. It used the remains of the old Roman town walls as foundations. This detail is more than architectural convenience. It is symbolism. The Normans were effectively anchoring their authority into Rome's ancient footprint, taking the prestige and permanence of the Roman past and turning it into a platform for Norman rule. From across the Medway, the castle and Rochester Cathedral would have dominated the skyline together, twin landmarks projecting a combined message. The sword and the altar, the noble and the church, authority in both stone and faith. Most medieval castles were built by secular lords. Rochester is different. Here, the church played a direct role in castle construction, and that changes how we understand the site. Gundulf and later Archbishop William de Corbet show that ecclesiastical leaders were not only spiritual figures, they were administrators, political actors, and builders capable of shaping military landscapes. Rochester is one of the strongest examples of how closely castle and cathedral could be linked, sometimes sharing craftsmen, design habits, and logistical networks. Gundulf's defensive circuit had at least one tower, later replaced in the 14th century. The gateway too was radically altered in the 13th or 14th century, an important reminder that castles evolve. They are not one build, frozen in time. They are repeatedly modified, repaired, expanded, and sometimes deliberately dismantled, depending on the threats and resources of each era. If Gundulf laid the groundwork, Courbet created the icon. Rochester's keep, built in the second quarter of the 12th century, is the castle's defining feature and one of the finest surviving keeps of its era in England and France. It is square in plan, measuring about 70 by 70 feet, 21 by 21 metres externally, strengthened by pilaster buttresses at each corner. It was built in the castle's southern corner, close to the curtain wall, a position that allowed the keep to dominate the enclosure and also integrate with the outer defences. The materials tell a story of local strength and international connection. The main body used Kentish ragstone, a tough local stone, but the outer facing included Caen stone, imported from Normandy. That imported stone matters. It links Rochester to the wider Norman world, the same supply lines and aesthetic values used at elite royal sites, just as Caen stone had been brought across the Channel for the White Tower at the Tower of London. Rochester was not a backwater fort. Its builders treated it as a major statement. The keep's scale was meant to overawe. Its turret tops rise about 125 feet, 38 metres, above the ground, standing roughly 12 feet above the battlements. Rectangular holes beneath the battlements mark where wooden hoardings once projected outward, temporary timber galleries used in wartime to drop missiles straight down the walls. Even the wall thickness feels like a warning. About 12 feet thick at the base, tapering to around 10 feet at the top. This is the tallest keep in England, and only a handful, Dover, the Tower of London, Colchester, Norwich, outsize it. In a medieval landscape, a building like this wasn't just defensive. It was propaganda in stone, and it had scars. During King John's siege in 1215, the southeast corner collapsed after mining brought part of the structure down. Under Henry III it was rebuilt, but not as a simple repair. It became cylindrical, structural solution that also changed the keep's silhouette. Even the windows tell a subtle narrative. They grow larger, higher up the walls, a practical design for light and status, because the best rooms were above. The highest windows were decorated, reinforcing the idea that this was not merely a bunker. It was also a residence. Inside, staircases spiraled through the corners like arteries. One in the northeast gave access to all floors. Another in the southwest climbed from the first floor to the top. Corner towers held small chambers, private pockets of space built into the stone itself. Keeps were normally entered at first floor level, forcing attackers to climb while defenders controlled the approach. Rochester follows this classic pattern. The entrance was protected by a forebuilding on the north side, acting like a fortified antechamber. A stone staircase rose up the keep's west side, turned, and reached the forebuilding. The final approach required crossing a drawbridge, spanning a gap about 9 feet, 2.7 metres, wide. This arrangement created a series of choke points: stair, turn, drawbridge, forebuilding, then the keep doorway itself, guarded by a portcullis. Even if attackers broke into the outer castle, this entrance system was designed to slow, funnel, and punish them. At some later stage, a new doorway was knocked through near the bottom of the drawbridge pit. An alteration that hints at changing needs, perhaps easier access during peacetime or later reuse. but the original defensive logic remains readable in the surviving stone. Early stone keeps often had simple plans, a few rooms, straightforward layouts. Rochester is different. Its design shows a developing sophistication, an early example of separating spaces for the lord and his household, dividing functions vertically and horizontally. The interior is split from bottom to top by a massive cross wall running east-west. This was not a decorative feature. It was structural and defensive, creating two halves that could function independently, something that famously mattered in 1215 when half the keep collapsed and the defenders held the other half behind this very partition. The ground floor was mainly for storage. Above it, 3 stories provided living spaces. The first floor likely held a hall and great chamber separated by the cross wall. This level may have served the castle's constable when the owner was absent. Built into the thickness of the northwest wall is a small room later nicknamed Gundulph's Chamber, possibly the constable's private space, tucked into stone like a hidden retreat. The second floor was the finest. It rises about 27 feet, 8.2 meters high, and once had elaborate decoration. A gallery ran around the upper half, carved into the wall thickness. This floor also contained a chapel, about 28 by 15 feet, 8.5 by 4.6 meters. In other words, even inside the keep's hardest defensive core, worship and ritual were built into daily life. The keep's cross wall carried a well shaft, with well heads at each floor. That's a crucial survival feature. In a siege, water is life. A keep without secure water is a tomb. Rochester's designers ensured the defenders could hold out, at least in theory, for extended periods. The third floor included another chapel and roof access, and likely more accommodation. Over time, however, disaster reshaped everything. At some point after the medieval period, a major fire gutted the keep, destroying floors and roof and leaving the interior open to sky, the skeletal ruin we see today. But even in ruin, the stone still reveals the original grandeur. Openings in the cross wall framed by Romanesque columns and round-headed arches, a decorative rhythm that once softened the fortress's hard geometry. Outside the keep, the castle's curtain walls and towers formed the next defensive ring. The riverside curtain wall, the western stretch facing the Medway, dates back to the 12th century when the castle first received a full stone enclosure. Like the keep, it used Kentish ragstone. Its thickness narrowed from about 4.5 feet, 1.4 meters, at the base to about 2 feet, 0.61 meters, at the top, rising to around 22 feet, 6.7 meters, high. In the 13th century, builders added embrasures, arrow slits, imitating Norman design, showing how later, generations respected and copied earlier military aesthetics. The main gatehouse stood roughly where the current northeast entrance is now. Gundulph's original gatehouse was later rebuilt around 1249 to 1250, but it was pulled down in the 1870s when the enclosure became a municipal garden. An engraving from 1735 suggests its form, an arched passage between 2 projecting towers, approached not by a drawbridge but by a stone causeway across a ditch. That detail hints at a more permanent, engineered approach, less improvisational than the earliest Norman timber bridges. At the northwest corner, a later tower with a postern gate was built near the end of the 14th century to guard the bridge over the Medway. It no longer stands, but notes by the antiquary and engineer G.T. Clark mention mechanisms for lifting supplies from the river, an insight into Rochester's logistical mindset. Castles were not only about fighting, they were about sustaining garrisons, moving food, weapons, and materials efficiently under threat. Rochester's walls record the violence they endured. Near the southeast corner of the castle, a two-storey rounded tower about 30 feet, 9.1 metres, in diameter dates from the early 13th century. Its purpose was blunt: fill the breach caused during John's siege and reinforce a weak point. This is a physical reminder that siege warfare didn't just damage castles, it redesigned them. Repairs were often improvements, adapting to lessons learned under fire. The stretch of wall from that area toward the former main gatehouse was rebuilt between about 1367 and 1370, when two new towers were added, both 2 stories high, again in ragstone. One is plain, the northernmost is more elaborate, intended as a residence and later turned into a cottage in modern times. At some stage, the wall between them was reduced, possibly simply to give better views of the cathedral, a telling modern choice that values scenery over defence. A castle that once existed to dominate the cathedral's skyline later had its wall lowered so visitors could admire that skyline more fully. History changes what we want stone to do. Apart from the west side facing the river, the castle was once surrounded by a ditch. Much of it has since been filled in, another quiet transformation. The defensive void becomes ordinary ground as military need fades. Rochester Castle's plan and fabric tell a layered story. A lost first castle whose traces may linger at Bowley Hill, a stone fortress built by a bishop using Roman walls as foundations, and a monumental keep that combined residence, ritual, and ruthless defensive logic. Its materials speak of local geology and Norman networks. Its entrances show medieval obsession with control and choke points. Its interior reveals a shift from simple strongholds to complex vertical households, separating storage, servants, lordly chambers, and chapels, and its outer walls show continual adaptation, from Norman curtain walls to 13th century repairs after catastrophe, to 14th century rebuilding driven by new threats. In other words, Rochester isn't just a castle. It's a timeline in stone, one where every wall thickness, tower shape, stair turn, and patched breach is a sentence written by war, power, and survival.